And I was interested in the aspects of playing to Louis, envisioning him in all these scenes, because there's elements where it's the version of events that Louis remembers and his memories. But then there's also these really interesting tangents where it's almost conversations with his inner critic and his inner voice that he's having with himself, but it's easier to conjure Lestat as the voice of disagreement for him. And I was
Yeah.
interested in that side of things also being at play for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's really interesting is it's always a big conversation because I usually have a lot of questions. And I think particularly as this kind of thread of Louis becoming a photographer and exploring his kind of like journey to be an artist, or whether or not he is an artist, or whether or not he's like, really kind of astute businessman, which I think is what he sort of finds is that he's got this thread, but he explores being an artist. And my response to that was that I think Lestat would be very kind of encouraging of Louis to have that exploration in himself. And so obviously my instincts were, well, let's like make Lestat like really into it. Like let's make him and want to and you want to kill anybody who says that Louis is not a good photographer. And then obviously, they have to pair that back and be like, well, I'm not playing Lestat, I'm playing Louis. And who Louis is going to turn to for the most honest opinion on his work, um, and somebody who he feels, that there's a level of sort of unbreakable trust. And so, for Roland and Levin, I think, throughout that process, were always telling me to kind of actually be more cutthroat with the way that he's critiquing his work, because he's the only person who's going to give him the truth. Um, and and obviously that's Louis looking at his own work and saying, actually, it's pretty average. So it's a very complex thing because you're trying to show that there is this kind of deep love between these two characters. There is a sweetness, there's a kindness, and you don't want to hurt the feelings of the ones that you love. Obviously, these guys hurt each other all the time, and that's kind of part of their MO. But in terms of like trying to kind of be supportive of Louis' art, but also really having to drive the narrative and the story forward and using the start as a very specific device. So it's complex. And I always sort of rail against it because I'm always a bit like, is this kind of like setting us back? And are people going to be able to understand that we're not using Lestat as Lestat here, but we're using him as the kind of like framework in which Louis needs to to discover more about himself? It's kind of messy, but fun.